Danse, Nêhîyaw. My name is André Bear, and I'm going to give you a brief history of First Nations governance from a Nêhîyaw perspective. Before contact, our people used to depend on clan systems. Everything focused on the family, and having children and growing our numbers was important to build a strong nation. We followed medicine people who were connected to the spirit world. We had beautiful societies that were harmonious with nature. Wealth was determined by how many families you could care for. Everyone played a role in upholding the moral values and contributing to the nation's survival. We had war, but we never valued killing or massacring people. We believed in the most skilled thing that you could do is count coup and embarrass your enemies. When somebody died or was killed in battle, there was a rule to replace the warrior that was killed with one of your own warriors. And this made enemies related and cemented familial ties with different nations. Nêhîyaw is the Cree law of relationships. Everyone and everything is related somehow, and only through working together can we find peace within ourselves and peace within each other. I'm not saying that things were perfect back in those days, but if you believe our oral history and not the history colonizers will tell you about us, it was peaceful. Our oral history goes back since time immemorial. This means we have been here since the beginning of time itself. This is evident through our creation stories, our languages, our beliefs, our laws, and our DNA, which is intrinsically tied to this land we call Turtle Island. Although there are many different nations with different creation stories, we all share the same inherent rights provided to us by the Creator. And with these rights comes sacred responsibilities to protect all life, including the land, the water, air, the medicines, the plants, and wildlife. When European settlers came, they brought Eurocentric education, religion, and disease. They believed that because there were no Christians on Turtle Island, the millions of indigenous peoples who lived here were not considered human. Therefore, through the powers of white supremacy, this enabled them by the doctrine of discovery, the land was theirs for the taking. Over 500 years, British and French colonies began forming alliances with different nations across the country. These alliances eventually became relationships, and those relationships eventually led to treaty agreements. Today, there are different treaties across the country where nations were promised a number of things by the Crown in exchange to share the land. Despite the written text of most treaty agreements, it's widely known that Indigenous nations have never agreed to cede or surrender our land. This is why Canadian courts are now backed up with enough land claims to bankrupt this country. Remember, treaties are always made in good faith, meaning the Crown had always intended to keep their promises. And today, Canadian courts would also agree that the treaty agreements must be fulfilled, or Indigenous nations will have grounds to sue Canada for failing to uphold these treaty promises. Treaties have created rights that many nations now carry. I'm a descendant of Treaty Number 6. These rights are to the land, housing, education, healthcare, payment annuities, agricultural benefits, and the right to be free from taxation. This is because in exchange for sharing the land with settler society, Indigenous nations would be distinctly recognized as a sovereign nation with rights that would ensure our own prosperity within the modern world. The land was only meant to be shared to the depth of a plow, and these reserves were set aside for our own exclusive use as First Nations. But keep in mind that the traditional territories of First Nations were also never given up to the Crown. And this is also why there are so many land claims today within Canadian courts. Even though the written versions of treaty talk about ceding and surrendering land, this was never the intention of First Nations. And many nations that don't have treaties with the Crown are constantly battling with Canadian, provincial, and territorial governments for their fair share of land. First Nations did not have property laws like Europe, but we had treaties with each other that respected the collective ownership of our territories. Our laws of Nêhîyaw were the near opposite of individual ownership and separation. We had territories that often changed during different times of the year, but for the most part, the land did not belong to us. It was us who belonged to the land. In 1876, Treaty Number 6 was signed, which included specific promises like land where it was 1 square mile per family of 4, the treaty right to health care through the medicine chest clause, the treaty right to education, and the treaty right to relief during times of famine and pestilence. There was rights to hunt, to fish, to gathering, and more. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, in the same year of 1876, the Indian Act was being implemented, which entirely contradicted the idea that these treaty agreements were actually being made in good faith. Because on one end, these treaties had created equality with the nation-to-nation agreements to share the land, where First Nations became empowered through these rights to succeed in this modern world. On the other end of the country, the government had implemented legislation that was created to subjugate First Nations into a 150-year process of forced assimilation, apartheid, and flat-out genocide. If there was any moment in time when the relationship between First Nations and the Crown had taken a turn for the worse, this was it. To me, the great injustice against Indigenous peoples in Canada had started with the Indian Act in 1876. This was what was imposed to take us away from the treaty relationship and force us into becoming wards of the Crown instead. The Indian Act systematically imposed violent control over our land, our governments, our laws, our languages, our families, our cultures, and even attempted to wipe out our children through the legacy of Indian residential schools. The Indian Act is what imposed the chief and council system and the pass system so we could no longer leave the reserve and prevented us from gathering or hiring lawyers, and it even banned our sun dances and other ceremonies. From my own perspective, the Indian Act was imposed to sever our connection to the land and destroy our spiritual identity. They did this systematically by targeting our families, our women, and our children. This is what created a new governing system on the reserve that was imposed on us and intended to destroy our traditional governing system. It starts with the chief and council model, where no checks and balances exist on the governments that we elect. Nothing is stopping the elected chief and council from doing whatever they want to gain power and to keep it. Through the Indian Act, there is no legislative assembly and no judicial body. There is no separation of powers to ensure that the nation is governed fairly. I believe that this was absolutely intentional. I believe the Indian Act governance model was intentionally created to provide or impose an ineffective governing body and keep our people under their control. What else do you think would happen if you kept hundreds of people corralled into a small reserve, forced them into poverty, tore apart their families with residential schools, and then gave them a small group a little bit of power to manage that poverty? I believe it's a recipe for disaster, and this is why so many of our nations are now in crisis under the management of this oppressive system that was designed to destroy our natural identity. So many of our elected chief and councils are truly good people who run to represent their nations honorably, but they become trapped within this ineffective governing system that was designed to keep us from unlocking our full potential as nations. Many of our leaders themselves are residential school survivors, and they are ridden with trauma from surviving the attempted genocide by the Canadian government. Even when they are elected, their powers are constrained by the Indian Act. They hold on to power that is not equally distributed like any other effective government model, and they can only manage the poverty created by this process of violent settler colonialism. From the very beginning, our elected governments have been battling over 150 years of colonial domestication under the Indian Act. And the actual rights holders of the nation know that these Indian Act systems are corrupt. So they will blame the very leaders that they elected and expect them to change the status quo, which is often not possible for most of them. All our leaders can do is try to put out fires when they can and manage whatever crisis their nation is facing next to the best of their ability. Now add the factors of extreme poverty, intergenerational trauma, addictions, and a lack of clean drinking water, overcrowded housing, and underfunding in every sector of government with no opportunities and no hope in sight. What you will get is a suicide crisis, a crystal meth crisis, or both. Because without hope and nothing to look forward to, at least Indigenous peoples can try to escape that pain from their trauma with something that is within reach. Even when we move to the cities where more social programs are available, we are treated with some of the worst forms of racism that societies have to offer, where First Nations have the highest rates of over-incarceration, homelessness, drug addiction, discrimination in healthcare. We are the most overrepresented in the child welfare system, and we are most likely to be murdered or go missing in Canada. So why can't we just get over the past and move on like everybody else? The reason is that to this day, First Nations have never been given what they are owed. Instead of upholding the treaty agreements, Canada decided to implement legislation that was designed to create this crisis that you see First Nations are facing. In a more just society, instead of implementing the Indian Act, the government would remain loyal to our treaty agreements and begin fulfilling those promises that were made specifically to prevent this poverty and these social issues that we are facing today. The reason why we can't just get over it is because the Indian Act is still in full effect, and the promises made under treaty have yet to be honored and meaningfully implemented. People often say, well, Canada only assumes sovereignty over Indigenous land and they don't actually own it, so First Nations should just start by taking back our land by force. But the reason why we don't do that is because we are still honoring the treaty relationship that our ancestors had envisioned, to share the land in peaceful coexistence. And it's now Canada's job to step up and begin fulfilling those promises.